chapter 12. And we'll read verses 1 through 16, the whole chapter, beginning with Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. When the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, do not punish us, because we have done foolishly and have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb." And Moses cried to the Lord, "O God, please heal her, please." And the Lord said to Moses, "If her father had but spit in her face, should she not be shamed 7 days? Let her be shut outside the camp 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again." So Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march till Miriam was brought in again. After that the people set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. This text warns us not to become full of ourselves and speak against God because we don't like the way he's doing things. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, and at first they spoke against him because he had married a Cushite woman. And Cush was what I think today is Ethiopia. He married an African woman instead of a Hebrew woman, and they didn't really like that, and people apparently have been this way for thousands of years. They don't like you marrying somebody different. They think you should marry somebody like yourself and things like that. And people complain about it and talk about you and that kind of thing if you marry somebody who's different. But as far as I can tell in the Bible, the only requirement you really have is that they be someone who worships God like we do. You don't go off and marry a pagan person. So as long as this lady was a believing woman who followed Yahweh and was willing to take Moses' religion and his worship of God on and practice it, then there's nothing wrong with him marrying her, no matter where she came from. But Apparently the problem wasn't really with him marrying the Cushite woman anyway. Verse 2 gets into what the problem really was. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. They were envious, particularly Miriam. I think that's why she's the one named first in verse 1, and she's the one struck with leprosy later on in the chapter. Miriam was the ringleader here, and Aaron just got drug along apparently, but she didn't like the fact that Moses was getting all of the attention, and everybody was listening to what Moses said and talking about how great Moses was and all that kind of stuff. She wanted more of the recognition, is what it sounds like to me. And she says, hasn't God also spoken through us? Is Moses the only one God's spoken through? And, well, no. I mean, God speaks through lots of people. But still, in every generation, there's some people that God may use in a special way that is really great, like Billy Graham, and then there's other people that God just doesn't work in such a powerful way through them all the time. I mean, the world's full of teachers and preachers and people serving God, and there's only a handful whose ministries just kind of explode and become very popular and very effective, and we see lots and lots of people get saved, but that's in God's hands. He works how he wants to work. He works through whom he wants to work. Our job is to serve God wherever he puts us and to be faithful to him. I think we have a warning here, though, that we don't need to oppose God. God was not happy when this happened. God didn't just take it as Miriam poking her brother, because Moses was her brother. Moses and Aaron and Miriam were all siblings as far as I can tell. And this wasn't just sibling rivalry. This was opposition to Moses and his leadership, and by extension, opposition to God and what he was doing through Moses. And we've got to be careful that we don't let our own self-centeredness and selfish desires make us stand up and oppose what God himself is doing. There are lots of times where pastors and other leaders in churches and leaders in associations and denominations and things will lead in a way that are not always popular with everybody. I mean, I don't know that anybody ever leads in a way that is popular with everybody. But we don't need to rise up and stand against what God is doing so that we get what we want. And we do get tempted that way. In our day, I think we see that where change is trying to be brought about in something, and people will just pitch a fit because they don't want to change. I heard a guy who was trying to lead a church to replant and change things and reach the community and grow again, and he thought the Sunday school class that was right by the door of the church needed to be moved and put in the nursery there. He said, if we moved the Sunday school class that's right by the front door of the church, then all these mothers carrying these baby carriers and things wouldn't have to carry the baby carrier all the way through the church building and maybe even upstairs or something. Anyway, they had a long walk, and the people who had been in that Sunday school room for years didn't like it, and they pitched a fit. No, we like having the space by the door because then we don't have to walk through the building. And he says, well, I'm here temporarily anyway. I'm just going to move the room. And so he went in there and took all the furniture out from the adults that had been in there for years And he put all the stuff from the nursery or the preschool or whatever in there, and he moved all the furniture to another room in the church and kind of reversed the two rooms. And those people got to church the next Sunday, and boy, were they mad. And they're just in there pitching a fit, but all their furniture from their room had been moved, so they couldn't just go in and have Sunday school in the nursery. And we want to do stuff like that. If there really is stuff that needs to be changed, then we should support the change, even if it's inconvenient for us and uncomfortable. And, music's been one of those sticky points for a long time. And it's not even just in my lifetime. I mean, it was a sticky point. During the Reformation, they were writing newer songs from what I've been told, they used the songs that were sung in the bars or something with the music part, and then made Christian words for it and sang them. And a lot of people just hated that. You can't go around singing this stuff, but it was biblical stuff. And so, if you're singing biblical stuff, then it doesn't really matter if the style's different from what you used to and prefer. Learn some new songs, sing some new songs. Learn to think in different ways about God. You might learn something about God that you haven't thought about before by learning a new song. New music is a good thing, and we should do that. But then moving on to the next part of the text, in verses 3 through 9, Moses was Moses was meek and didn't defend himself, but God came to his defense. Verse 3, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord came to Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. So it talks about Moses' meekness. Moses wasn't one of these guys who goes around throwing his weight around and trying to make everybody do what he wants them to do because he's the boss. And we've seen these people. They'll go around and tell everybody what they're supposed to do and tell everybody how everything's supposed to change. And, in churches, they'll go around announcing, I'm the pastor and this is what we're going to do. Well, Moses wasn't like that at all. He had a meek attitude. He controlled himself. He considered other people important besides himself. He was a very, very godly man. And even here, where his sister and brother come to oppose his leadership and want more of their own recognition, he doesn't fight back. He doesn't argue. He controls himself, and he is meek. That is what meekness is. It's power under control. He could have blasted his sister for what she said, but he didn't. And that's one of those lessons a lot of people can do well to learn today. Don't go around and blast everybody who opposes you or does something you don't like. People have all got too much of a platform these days. Anything you don't like, you can just go on the internet and blast away everything. And it'd probably be good if we just turn those things off and stop blasting everybody, because it's not loving, it's not good, it doesn't help. We need to love people and not go around blasting people. But Moses didn't blast his sister and yell back at her or anything. He just kept himself under control, and God took care of it. God came down and called them to the tent of meeting, and God explained that if there's a prophet among them, God makes himself known to them in visions and dreams. Meaning God speaks to the prophets, but it's in ways that are not direct. You get a word in your heart through the Holy Spirit. You have a dream about what should be done or something like that. It's kind of indirect and you have to interpret it. But then he says, verse 7, not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? I mean, it's one thing to speak against somebody who's going around doing a bunch of stuff they probably shouldn't do and everybody knows it. But Moses wasn't like that. Moses was faithful to God in everything. He followed God's leadership. He did the things God told him to do. Moses was a godly leader, and God came down and met with him in the tent of meeting or on Mount Sinai, and God spoke to him as directly as anybody gets spoken to by God, except like Jesus and the disciples in the New Testament. But for the Old Testament, Moses had the most direct conversations with God that anybody had. And even though Aaron and Miriam could see that, I mean, they could see their brother going to the tent of meeting and the cloud comes down and God and Moses talk, and still they got full of themselves and they spoke against him, and they didn't like the way things were being done, and I think they wanted more of the attention for themselves, and they didn't keep their mouth shut, and they opposed God. And it says, the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And when the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous. We need to be careful when we speak against God and what he is doing. It's one thing to speak against something that's happening that's really not right and shouldn't happen. You're supposed to stand against stuff that is wrong. And even if the leader that has been put in the church or in the association or wherever is doing something wrong, then you need to speak up and say so and say this needs to change. We can't do that. But if they're just following God and doing what God says needs to be done, and you stand against it, you could very easily find yourself opposing God, and you really don't want to be there. We can seek to follow Moses' example here and not go around blasting back at people who oppose us. Be respectful even to our enemies and let God bring the consequences. But on the other side, if we're the ones expecting godly leadership from other people, and God has given us godly leadership, and they're faithfully preaching and teaching and leading, then we need to listen to them and respect them. We don't always agree with things, like that story about that church replanter who was wanting to switch the Sunday school rooms around. The people didn't like it. It was inconvenient. The people who had been in that room for years had to walk a lot farther, and they weren't happy. But still, if it turns out that you are better able to minister to young people, and you see the people come to church easier because they can actually come in and get their kids taken care of quickly, then it's a good thing. And we don't need to oppose things like that that are good for the church and good for us and good for gospel ministry. So then at the end of the passage in verses 10 through 16, God gave Miriam leprosy. And Moses asks God to heal her. And God does, but there are still consequences. Sometimes we have consequences too. Sometimes we do things we know we shouldn't be doing, and God does things in our lives. I've heard stories about things like this. Preacher in church that weren't really seeing eye to eye on stuff, and there was some disagreement, and I think it must have happened even in a worship service, and the preacher just comes to the front, kneels down and starts praying. A couple of the men that didn't like the way he was doing things came and picked him up and carried him out the door. You're not going to be here anymore. We don't like you.
We ain't listening to you. We don't like what you're doing, you know, all that kind of stuff. They just carried him out the door. I heard this from Ted Traylor at Olive Baptist Church in a sermon one time, so I trust that it's true. I respect Dr. Traylor. He said one of those guys that carried him out the door died soon. The other one lived longer, but he died crippled. And so I do think that there are still consequences when things like this in this text happen. The thing is, we don't always know that's what the consequences were, and that's why things happened. And I mean, I don't doubt today that there are people who have died because they stood against the things of God. But God doesn't come down to the outside of the church and stand at the front door and announce it anymore. You just may have somebody who didn't live as long as they would have because they stood up and opposed something God was telling them to do, or maybe they got sick or something like that. Paul talks in the New Testament about people who take the Lord's Supper unworthily, and they are either sick or fallen asleep. So there's another passage where you have God bringing consequences against people for disobeying him and dishonoring him. The point is, we need to be careful how we live and how we treat the leaders that God has placed over us. We need to be respectful, and we need to seek the will of God and be sure that we're not being self-centered and saying, I'm going to have things done the way I want them done. We need to do the best we can to do things the way God is saying for them to be done, even if it's something that we don't personally like. So Moses has this happen, and his sister gets leprosy, and her skin turns all flaky like it's rotting off or something. And Moses doesn't like this. He's a humble man. He's a godly man. He's not one to have his sister destroyed or anything like that because she opposed him. And Moses asked God to please heal her in verse 13. And God does, but he says, if her father had spit in her face, should she not be shamed 7 days? That was the law, apparently, in the Old Testament. If you disrespect your father, the punishment for something small is being put outside the camp for 7 days. And so the punishment or the uncleanness that comes from having a case of leprosy, and the result is that you have to be put outside the camp for 7 days. And that was part of the Old Testament teaching too, with all their laws about cleanliness and uncleanliness. So God says, even though I've healed her, she had leprosy, and she still has to obey the rule about being put outside the camp for a week. I think the point behind the rule was so that you quarantine that person somewhere else so that they had time to heal from the skin disease and they didn't spread it to somebody else. But in this case, it was kind of, I think, being put in time out because she opposed God. And I think for us today, we have to realize that our sin does have consequences. We may sin and God may not strike us dead or something crazy like that. It may not be that severe, but a lot of times our sin does still have consequences. And even though God forgives us, we can say, Lord, I sinned, I did something wrong. Please forgive me and don't hold it against me. He'll forgive us. He'll wipe our sin away if we'll confess and ask forgiveness. But a lot of times you still have to serve your sentence, pay your dues, whatever way you want to put it. If you go out and do something you shouldn't do and get in trouble for it, then a lot of times there are still consequences, and the consequences don't go away just because you confess your sin to God and He forgives you. So the better thing to do is be careful how we live day to day, and don't let ourselves become full of ourselves doing things that we know we shouldn't do, but it's what we want, so we're going to do it anyway. We need to live in submission to God, honor Him as holy, respect the people that He places in leadership above us. In this text, that applies more to spiritual leadership, but The Bible also talks about kings and bosses or supervisors or whatever, things like that in the New Testament. I mean, God puts us under a lot of leadership, and a lot of times we don't like what they do, but we still need to honor them and respect them because God has placed them in leadership over us. Now we're going to have a time of invitation. It's a good time to examine our hearts and say, Lord, is there something in me where I have not submitted to you in the way that I should? Maybe I've dishonored somebody in leadership over me this week, and I need to confess that and repent for that, and maybe go back to them and apologize and ask for forgiveness. Because a lot of times we can have a short temper, and somebody comes and tells us, hey, you're not supposed to do that, and we'll just blow up and start attacking back, and that is not the way we should be. God's people should be holy and righteous and respectful and be good witnesses to all those that we are around. So we're going to have a time of invitation. If there's a decision that you need to make before God, if there's something He is calling you to do, please go ahead and spend a few minutes talking to Him as we sing. Make sure your heart is right before Him.